My children thought I was just watching over things, that my hands were free labor and my voice, background noise. It was convenient for them to forget who I used to be, that my signature once had the power to take someone's freedom, that I wore the robe while they were still learning to walk. And then I disappeared. No shouting, no letter. A month later in court, they found out the guardianship had changed and that I wasn't just the grandmother anymore. I was the law again. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Hanlon. I was 72 years old when I moved into my daughter's house in Marietta, Georgia. The neighborhood was suburban and neat, full of driveways lined with SUVs and mailboxes with flower decals. Her home sat on a quiet cul-de-sac where every lawn looked trimmed with a ruler and every house had the same gray siding. It wasn't where I imagined myself retiring, but it was close enough to the grocery store and far enough from my past that I could pretend this new chapter would be peaceful. I had been a superior court judge for over 30 years before retirement. I wore the robe for longer than most people hold one job. I dealt with murder cases, custody battles, real estate fraud, and corporate embezzlement. I saw humanity in its worst and most revealing forms. I kept meticulous notes. I was known for my stern presence, my calm voice, and my refusal to tolerate emotional manipulation in the courtroom. When I stepped down, I packed my office into 6 boxes and didn't look back. I thought I was done with rulings, with paperwork, with being the one responsible. I was wrong. Charlotte, my only child, had asked for help when her second child was born. It wasn't supposed to be long-term, just a few weeks while she and her husband adjusted. "We just need a little time to settle into a rhythm," she'd said. I believed her. I always wanted to be a present mother, and even more so, a dependable grandmother. So I packed my things, locked up my small home, and moved in. At first, I approached everything like a structured case file. I made a schedule, color-coded it, and printed 3 copies, one for myself, one for Charlotte, and one for the fridge. Breakfast at 7:15, school drop-off at 8 CR, laundry, groceries, and cleaning rotated by day. Nap time at 1 CR, pickup at 3:10, dinner at 5:30, bath, books, bed by 7:30. It worked, like all systems do in the beginning. The children were sweet but wild. Daniel, 6, had a tendency to lie when he didn't want to do something, and Ava, barely 3, refused to sleep alone. I wasn't surprised. Children push boundaries, it's their job, but I enforced them gently. Consistency, order, rules, that's how children feel safe. That's how courts function, and homes too. What I hadn't anticipated was the slow disappearance of acknowledgement. At first, Charlotte and her husband Alex thanked me every evening. They brought home takeout. They asked how the kids had behaved. They even insisted I sleep in the master bedroom. But within weeks, that gratitude thinned. They stopped asking. They came home later and later. Sometimes they skipped dinner altogether. The thank yous faded into silence, and my bedroom, originally a place of comfort, began to feel like a borrowed room in someone else's house. I adjusted. I always adjusted. That's what judges do. They observe, they adapt, and they act when necessary. I woke every morning before the children. I made oatmeal from scratch, sliced bananas into even circles, poured 2% milk into color-coded cups. I laid out clothes, brushed little teeth, tied shoes, packed lunches, and reviewed spelling words on the way to school. I attended parent-teacher conferences. I signed permission slips. I booked doctor appointments and sat through waiting rooms that smelled like disinfectant and juice boxes. No one called me a nanny. No one called me anything at all. At night, after the kids were asleep and the dishwasher hummed its lullaby, I would sit at the kitchen table with my planner and review the next day's logistics. I marked appointments with sticky notes, adjusted schedules when Charlotte had late meetings, and rearranged pickups when Alex forgot his turn. They never told me directly, but it became clear. I was no longer just helping. I was the foundation of their domestic infrastructure. And like all infrastructure, I was expected to function quietly and without thanks. Once, when I tried to discuss boundaries, Charlotte looked at me with surprise, as if I were making a fuss over something natural. "Mom, you're just watching the kids," she'd said. Just, just, as if the years I spent on the bench, wearing the robe, signing warrants, and making life-altering decisions were wiped away by the act of folding tiny socks and scheduling dentist appointments. I had no resentment toward my grandchildren. They were too young to understand the difference between love and labor, but I began to notice a shift in the way they saw me. Ava stopped asking for bedtime stories and started demanding them. Daniel called me Grandma, with a tone that sounded more like housekeeper. When I corrected them gently, they rolled their eyes the way their mother did when she was a teenager. Still, I endured. I endured the way I had endured 1,000 courtrooms, with quiet observation. I listened to every detail. I noticed every crack. I paid attention to what they didn't say, because that's where the real truth lives, in omission. In the quiet moments, I sometimes stood in front of the mirror and reminded myself who I used to be. I recited old case numbers. I remembered the names of victims and defendants and verdicts. I remembered how my voice echoed in a courtroom when I read a decision aloud, the silence that followed, the power that came from speaking truth with authority. And then I would turn away, back to the sound of Ava crying for another glass of water, or Daniel refusing to brush his teeth. Each day began to feel more like a sentence I hadn't consented to serve, but I kept records. I always kept records, because I knew a time would come when someone would need to understand not just what I did, but why. And when that time came, they would learn something they had forgotten. I wasn't just watching the children, I was watching everything. Over time, my presence in the house faded into the background, not in a malicious way, not as a result of some planned neglect, but more like an object that people grow used to seeing. A chair in the corner, a humming refrigerator. I had become part of the architecture of their lives. I was there, I was reliable, and I asked for nothing in return. And in that silence, I slowly ceased to exist as a person in their eyes. At first, I thought it was temporary. I told myself it was just the natural shift of gratitude becoming routine. But the change was deeper than that. It wasn't just that they stopped saying thank you. It was the way they began to assume I would always be there, the way they stopped checking in, the way they left longer and longer lists on the fridge without comment, as if I were staff, not family, not a guest, but something in between, something necessary yet invisible. One Sunday evening, they all went out to a birthday party for one of Alex's colleagues. I wasn't invited. No one said it outright. They just left the kids with me and mentioned they might be late. I watched them through the window as they got into the car, laughing at something Charlotte said. I returned to the kitchen and cleaned up the dinner plates I had just served. Daniel had spilled juice on the floor. Ava had left her mashed potatoes untouched. I swept, mopped, and put them both to bed before the house went silent. That night, I sat on the porch in the dark and listened to the crickets. The breeze was cool, and for a moment, I could almost imagine I was alone by choice, but I wasn't. I was alone because they had stopped seeing me as someone who might need company. It crept in slowly, the realization. They had reshaped the narrative of our arrangement in their minds. I was no longer a grandmother helping for a season. I was living with them, a phrase that Alex once used when talking to a friend on speakerphone. I caught it as I passed through the hallway. Yeah, her mom's living with us. She helps out with the kids, which is great. Helps out. Those words stuck with me like a poorly stitched hymn. I began to pay attention to their language. Charlotte would say things like, "Since you're home anyway," or, "You know how the kids like their routines," as if I had no routine of my own, as if I existed entirely within theirs. The turning point came when I asked for a single weekend off. I wanted to attend a conference reunion for retired judges in Savannah. I had been invited by an old colleague and was looking forward to reconnecting with people who remembered me as more than just grandma. When I brought it up, Charlotte blinked at me like I'd asked for something strange. "Who's going to watch the kids?" she asked. Not unkindly, just flatly, as if the idea of me doing something personal, something outside their world, was foreign. I didn't argue. I said I'd think about it. Then I never brought it up again. Instead, I began writing notes in a small spiral notebook. Nothing detailed, just dates, times, patterns, how often they left after dark, how frequently they missed dinner, the tone of voice they used when asking for things. I wasn't collecting this out of spite. It was habit. Years on the bench had trained me to observe, to gather, to document. Now I turned that skill inward. There was also the money. When I checked my bank account one afternoon, I noticed a withdrawal I didn't recognize. It wasn't large, but it was strange. I dug through my online statements and found several more, recurring charges tied to their address, a grocery delivery subscription, a tutoring app, even a streaming service, all billed to me. I confronted Charlotte gently about it, and she waved it off. "Oh, I meant to fix that. You don't mind, right? We're all one family." One family, one account, one woman paying for everyone else's convenience. I did mind, but I didn't say so. I simply added it to the notebook. My days blurred together. Breakfast, drop-offs, errands, story time, pickups, dinner, bath, bed. I took care of every scraped knee, every meltdown, every forgotten permission slip. I smiled through exhaustion. I stayed up late filling in school calendars and reviewing class newsletters. And when the children asked me for help, they didn't say, "Please." They assumed I was available, that I had nothing better to do. One evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, I overheard Daniel talking to his younger sister. She asked why I was always there. He answered without thinking, "Because she doesn't have a real job." The words didn't hurt the way I expected them to. They didn't shock me. They confirmed something I had already known but refused to say aloud. They didn't see me as a person with a past, with credentials, with a name that used to mean something. To them, I was just the default nanny, built-in help, always home, always ready, always quiet, but I hadn't forgotten who I was. I hadn't forgotten what it meant to hold authority, not in a household, but in a courtroom. I hadn't forgotten the weight of silence when I entered a room, the pause before a verdict, the way an entire space shifted because I was present. I might have been dismissed in their eyes, but in mine, I had just begun to take note. I had spent most of my life reading between the lines. On the bench, it wasn't always what people said that revealed the truth. It was what they avoided, the hesitation before a sentence, the shift in tone, the body language. In a courtroom, truth was often hidden beneath layers of habit, fear, or intent. I had trained myself to see the shadows between words, the space where stories unraveled, and now, without meaning to, I began to notice those same shadows in the house I was living in. They were everywhere. It started with the calendar. I kept one on the fridge, color-coded and marked with appointments, assignments, pickup times, and meal plans. It was meant to help, to bring order. But over time, I noticed that entries were being added without my knowledge. PTA meetings, weekend playdates, parent conferences. They didn't ask if I was available. They simply wrote them down, assuming I would adjust. And I always did, until I realized that they had stopped consulting me entirely. Then came the emails. Charlotte had linked my email to the school system when I first moved in, and I still received all notifications. But one day, I opened a message about a disciplinary meeting for Daniel. It was marked forwarded, sent originally to Charlotte, then passed along to me. There was no note, no explanation, no mention at dinner, just an expectation that I would attend in her place. I did, of course. I sat across from the principal and teacher and listened as they described a playground argument. I handled it calmly, professionally, and promised appropriate follow-up. The teacher thanked me, calling me Mrs. Hanlon. I corrected her. Judge Hanlon, retired. Her eyebrows lifted. It was the first time in months I'd said it aloud. After that meeting, I began saving everything. Every email, every form, every forwarded message. I created folders in my inbox and printed hard copies. I logged every incident, every absence, every unplanned overnight stay. Not out of paranoia, but because it was the only way I knew how to process what was happening. If I was to be their default, their silent guardian, then I would document it. And if the time came when someone needed answers, I would have them. I began to notice how often the children were sick. Ava had recurring ear infections. Daniel came home with unexplained bruises from roughhousing. I always took them to the doctor, always paid the co-pays, always followed up. But the medical records listed me as caretaker, not guardian. I didn't correct it. Not yet. I simply asked for duplicate copies and filed them away. The finances were harder to track. Charlotte and Alex were sloppy with money. They treated my account like a communal well, dipping into it for small purchases, then justifying it with vague promises to reimburse. I stopped confronting them. I called my bank instead and requested itemized statements. I highlighted every unauthorized charge, every transaction tied to their vendors. I printed those too. It wasn't only what they did that concerned me. It was what they didn't do. They didn't ask the children how their day had been. They didn't attend school functions, even the big ones. At Ava's preschool recital, I was the only one in the front row clapping. The other parents waved to their kids. I waved for 3. I brought flowers she never expected, and when she hugged me, she whispered, "I thought Mommy forgot." They didn't cook. Most dinners came from boxes or apps. I made home-cooked meals on my nights, which slowly became every night. They didn't help with homework. I did that too. They didn't know their children's teachers by name. I brought cookies to every conference and stayed afterward to ask how Daniel was doing emotionally. They didn't discipline with patience. They scolded with tired eyes, brushing off behavior as someone else's fault. When I tried to suggest a different approach, I was told to stay in my lane. But I didn't have a lane anymore. I had an entire freeway of responsibility that no one else wanted to drive on. One evening, I heard them talking in the kitchen after they thought I'd gone to bed. Charlotte was complaining about her workload, and Alex said, "At least your mom's here. Imagine if we had to pay for a nanny." They both laughed. That laugh stayed with me. It echoed as I took out the trash, folded the laundry, and pulled the covers over Ava's sleeping form. It followed me into my room, where I sat down and opened my notebook, the one I'd been keeping in secret. I wrote down the date, the time, the words. At some point, I stopped calling it a notebook. It was evidence. I wasn't sure yet what I would do with it, but I knew I needed to be prepared. I had seen too many families fall apart in courtrooms because someone hadn't kept records, because someone had trusted too easily. I wouldn't make that mistake. The last thing I did each night was lock the drawer where I kept the files, not because I feared theft, but because I needed that boundary, one space that was still mine, one place that held the truth of what was happening, not the version they told themselves to make it easier. They saw me as the grandmother who baked cookies, who could be called on last minute, who didn't have a schedule or a spine. But they had forgotten, or maybe never truly known, that I spent decades reading lies off people's faces, that I knew what manipulation looked like when it wore the mask of kindness, that I knew how systems failed when no one paid attention. But I was paying attention, and one day they would find out what that meant. I made the decision to leave on a Wednesday. There was no final argument, no insult that broke me. It was quieter than that, a kind of stillness that settled in my bones after too many weeks of being spoken around, not to, of hearing my name only when something needed to be done, of listening to the sound of the front door closing later and later each night without so much as a message. I had become part of the scenery, the background hum of the household, a presence they used but never acknowledged. And I finally understood that I was no longer needed. I was only convenient. I didn't pack hastily. I gave myself 3 full days to prepare, moving slowly and deliberately through my tasks, as if I were building a case file again. I began with my documents, medical forms, school records, the notebook I had kept since the early months of my stay. I scanned copies of everything and placed them neatly in folders, labeled and sealed. I left nothing unsecured, nothing to chance. I packed one suitcase, not because I needed much, but because I wanted to make the act of departure clean. No mess, no leftovers. I folded my clothes with care. I took only what I had brought with me. The rest, the pillow Charlotte gave me for Mother's Day 3 years ago, the slippers Ava picked out for my birthday, the framed picture of Daniel smiling in a cowboy hat, stayed behind. They no longer belonged to me. Or perhaps I no longer belonged to them. I booked a one-way ticket to Asheville, North Carolina. I had visited once years ago during a judicial conference and remembered the calm of the mountains. A former colleague had retired there, a woman I admired for her sharp mind and uncompromising ethics. We had fallen out of touch, but I found her number tucked inside an old planner and dialed it with a strange kind of hope. She answered. When I told her I needed space, she offered me her guest house. No questions, no expectations, just time and room. I left a note on the kitchen counter the morning I departed. I didn't write a letter of anger or pain. I wrote the facts, that I had fulfilled my role longer than intended, that I had documented every shift in responsibility, that I could no longer continue without acknowledgement, without autonomy, without respect. I didn't sign it Mom or Grandma. I signed it with my full name, Margaret E. Hanlon. I set the alarm, locked the door, and placed my keys on the hallway table. At the airport, I felt no fear, only an unfamiliar lightness, as if I had finally stopped carrying a weight that had never been mine. The plane was half empty, and I stared out the window most of the flight, watching the clouds rearrange themselves in slow, quiet swells. When I arrived in Asheville, my friend met me at the terminal. She looked older than I remembered, but her eyes were the same, intelligent, clear, quietly curious. She didn't ask me why I had left. She only asked how long I needed. I told her I didn't know yet. The guest house was small but warm. It had a view of the woods, and the windows let in soft, golden light that didn't feel earned, only gifted. I unpacked in silence. I made tea and sat on the porch for hours without checking a clock. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking to a child's cry or the sound of a car pulling into the driveway at 2 a.m. No one called me. The silence in my phone was different from the silence in the house. It wasn't oppressive. It was honest. It told me exactly what I already knew. They didn't think I would leave. They didn't believe I could. And that was the root of it, really. They mistook my presence for dependence. They assumed that because I had stayed, I needed them. But I didn't. I had chosen to help. I had offered myself freely. And when the offering became expectation, when the gratitude turned into assumption, when the kindness hardened into utility, I reclaimed my name. In the days that followed, I walked for miles through wooded trails. I cooked for myself slowly, purposefully. I read books I hadn't touched in years. I called no one. I answered no messages. I let myself become small again, not invisible, but inward. I was not retreating. I was restoring. One morning, as I sipped coffee by the window, I thought of Ava's voice calling for me down the hallway, of Daniel asking me to fix the zipper on his backpack, of Charlotte tapping her pen against her phone as she scheduled yet another meeting. I missed them, but I did not regret leaving. I had been erased gently over time, replaced by their routines, absorbed by their convenience. But I had always known who I was. I had never forgotten. And now, in the silence and the softness of my new beginning, I remembered something else. I didn't need to raise my voice to reclaim my power. I only needed to leave, quietly, fully, without explanation, just like that. The call came 3 weeks after I left. It was from the school. The principal sounded hesitant, unsure of what had happened. He asked if I was still the primary contact for Daniel and Ava. I told him calmly and clearly that I was not. I gave him a number for Charlotte, then thanked him and hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand for several minutes afterward, not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. That was when I knew the unraveling had begun. From that moment, a quiet storm started building behind the scenes. Emails were sent, questions raised, and meetings scheduled. Charlotte and Alex, I imagined, were stumbling through explanations they hadn't prepared for, scrambling to regain control over something they had long since taken for granted. Meanwhile, I gathered everything. I sat at the table in the guest house and sorted through the files I had carried with me. The records, the notes, the medical forms, the attendance sheets, the messages, the receipts. I arranged them in chronological order, highlighting patterns of neglect, misuse, and assumption. It wasn't vindictive, it was procedural. I had spent my life studying cases just like this. I knew the burden of proof. I knew the language the court respected, and I knew that when the time came, I wouldn't speak with emotion. I would speak with evidence. I called Camille, a lawyer I had met during my judicial years. She had once presented a complex guardianship case before my bench. I remembered her composure, her clarity. Now she would be my counsel. I told her everything, not just the facts, but the nuances, the steady erosion of boundaries, the complete dependency they had created around me without ever admitting it. She listened. She asked sharp questions. Then she asked me what I wanted. I told her I didn't want revenge. I wanted legal clarity. I wanted the children's welfare protected. I wanted boundaries drawn not with guilt, but with law. She told me it was possible. Difficult, yes, but possible. Camille filed for a temporary guardianship reassessment on my behalf, citing dereliction of primary care. I provided the documentation of medical appointments I had attended alone, school conferences I had signed off on, and patterns of parental absence that could be corroborated by teachers and neighbors. We didn't accuse, we demonstrated. News of the filing must have reached them quickly. Within 2 days, I began receiving texts from Charlotte, short, clipped, vaguely apologetic. She asked if we could talk. She said things had been hectic, that they had appreciated everything I'd done, that the kids missed me. I didn't reply. A week later, a certified letter arrived. It was from their attorney, a formal request to drop the case and resolve things within the family. It mentioned misunderstanding, unintended consequences, and the desire to avoid court proceedings. I forwarded it to Camille. She laughed, not cruelly, but knowingly. We proceeded. The court hearing was scheduled for early fall. It would take place in the same building where I had presided over countless cases. I hadn't returned there since retirement. But as I walked up the courthouse steps that morning, I didn't feel out of place. I felt steady. The years melted away as I passed through security, nodded at the clerk, and entered the familiar chambers. Charlotte and Alex were already inside. They looked tired, nervous. Charlotte avoided my gaze. Alex looked angry in the way people do when they realize their power has limits. I sat silently beside Camille and watched as the proceedings began. Camille laid out the case with precision. She showed timelines, detailed patterns, provided statements from pediatricians and school officials. She quoted policy. She used my notebook. She used their silence. She painted a picture not of cruelty, but of carelessness. A household where responsibility had been shifted, then forgotten. A situation where the welfare of 2 young children had depended entirely on one woman who had never been officially acknowledged. The judge listened. He asked questions. He didn't smile. When it was their turn to speak, their lawyer emphasized family bonds, temporary stress, and intentions. But intentions don't hold up against facts. I didn't testify. I didn't need to. Everything I wanted to say had already been said, in records, in actions, in omissions. Camille concluded by requesting the court to consider a temporary transfer of guardianship, not to me directly, but to a neutral party for further assessment, until a full custody review could be conducted. The judge ruled in our favor. It wasn't final. It wasn't a severance, but it was a line, a formal legal acknowledgement that what had happened was not acceptable, that I had not imagined the imbalance, that my records mattered. I left the courtroom quietly. I didn't speak to Charlotte. She didn't approach me. As I walked down the courthouse steps, I passed the hallway where I used to sit before trial began. I remembered how many families I had seen torn apart in those rooms, by anger, by pride, by silence. But this wasn't about tearing anyone apart. It was about reestablishing truth. And the truth was this: I had been more than a grandmother. I had been the one who stayed, who saw, who documented, who protected. And now I was the one who had spoken, without ever raising my voice. The day of the hearing arrived quietly. There were no warnings in the sky, no signs that anything monumental was about to occur. The morning was overcast, with a low gray ceiling that seemed to press everything closer to the ground. I dressed deliberately, dark blue slacks, a cream blouse, and the same leather flats I had worn during my final month on the bench. I didn't wear my old robe, of course, but I carried something heavier than fabric. I carried presence. And presence, I had learned, can be louder than words. Camille picked me up at 8. She didn't speak much on the way. She didn't need to. We had reviewed every detail, every timeline, every legal point of reference. We didn't walk into court as a grandmother and her lawyer. We walked in as a team. The courthouse had changed in small ways. The benches were newer, the metal detector more sensitive, the security staff younger. But the layout was the same. The smell, wood polish and dust, was the same. The subtle echo of footsteps in the high-ceilinged corridors. I had walked those halls for over 3 decades. They remembered me. The hearing was being held in one of the medium-sized courtrooms, one typically reserved for family matters and probate. There were no juries here, just the judge, the attorneys, and the record. That was all that mattered. I entered first and sat quietly beside Camille. Across the aisle, Charlotte and Alex were already in their seats. They both looked tired, and I noticed how Alex kept glancing at his phone, as if some text or call might save him from what was unfolding. Charlotte's expression was harder to read. Her eyes flicked up when I walked in, and for a brief moment, I saw something like recognition, not of me as her mother, but of me as someone she'd forgotten how to measure. The judge entered. He was young, mid-40s, I guessed, and I didn't recognize him, but he recognized me. I saw it in the way his eyes paused when reading the docket, the subtle lift of his brow. He knew who I was, not just Margaret Hanlon, Judge Hanlon. That acknowledgement didn't sway the law, but it shaped the room. It made it impossible to pretend that I was just a retired woman with complaints. I was a professional, one who understood every word of the proceedings. Camille spoke first. She laid out the factual basis for the hearing, a pattern of informal custodial transfer, financial dependency without consent, and prolonged unsupervised child care without formal guardianship. She spoke with poise and precision, referencing the notebook we had compiled and attaching the exhibits with quiet confidence. I watched the judge's pen move, taking notes. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look skeptical. He listened. Then it was their attorney's turn. He took a different approach, one I had anticipated. He spoke of family values. He emphasized the temporary nature of the arrangement. He framed my departure as unexpected, emotionally charged, and unnecessary. He suggested that the matter could have been resolved with better communication. Charlotte looked at me then, just briefly, as if to say, "Why didn't you just talk to us?" I wanted to answer her. I wanted to say that I had spoken in every way I knew how, and that their refusal to hear wasn't the same as my refusal to speak. But I stayed still. Camille would speak for me now. When the judge asked for clarification, Camille provided detailed timelines, dates when I had sole care of the children, school documents with my signature, receipts from doctor visits I had paid for, emails from teachers who confirmed I was the only consistent adult present. She did not argue. She revealed. There was a pause after she finished, a long one. The judge looked down at the file in front of him, then back up. Then he asked if anyone else would like to speak. Camille turned to me, and for a moment I hesitated, not because I was afraid, but because I knew the power of words in that room. I had once wielded it. Now I chose to use it again. I stood and walked to the witness stand. My steps were slow, deliberate. I placed my hand on the edge of the rail and looked at the judge. I said only what needed to be said, that I had stepped in to help my family with good intentions, that those intentions were gradually taken for granted, that I had been the children's only consistent guardian for over a year, that I had used my own funds, my own time, my own life to ensure their safety and stability, that I had not come to court for revenge or drama or punishment. I came because there needed to be clarity. I came because the children deserved accountability. When I finished, there was no response from Charlotte. Alex shifted in his seat. Their lawyer scribbled something on a legal pad and handed it over without speaking. The judge thanked me and asked me to sit. He didn't issue a ruling that day. Family courts rarely do on the first hearing. But he did issue a statement that made the direction clear. He found sufficient cause to authorize a formal investigation into custodial fitness and temporary oversight by a third party, one chosen by the court. The hearing ended. Charlotte stood slowly. Her face was blank, or maybe just stunned. Alex left the room without looking back. I walked out with Camille, the way I had once walked out alone after rendering judgment on others. The sun was lower now, and the clouds had broken apart, letting thin rays of light stretch across the sidewalk. I didn't feel victorious. I felt necessary, and that, I realized, was enough. The weeks that followed the hearing moved slowly. Time no longer felt like it belonged to a household or a school schedule. It moved in long, silent intervals, punctuated by emails from Camille and periodic check-ins from the court-appointed guardian who had been assigned to evaluate Daniel and Ava's home environment. I kept to myself during that time, not out of spite, but out of discipline. After so many years of structure and law, I had learned how to wait. The temporary guardian was a woman named Teresa Mendez. She had a background in child advocacy and wore her professionalism like armor. I met her once, briefly, at the courthouse, just long enough for her to verify a few documents and assure me that her review would be impartial. That was all I needed. I didn't want to sway her. I wanted the truth to emerge on its own. I knew the process she would follow. Home visits, interviews with the children, observations of routines, and notes on the emotional tone of the household. She would review finances, school attendance, medical records. She would speak with neighbors, teachers, even pediatricians. Her job was to determine whether the environment Charlotte and Alex had created was stable, attentive, and aligned with the best interests of the children. It was not. I wasn't privy to the full report, of course, but Camille shared the highlights: missed appointments, conflicting accounts of daily routines, gaps in financial responsibility, discrepancies between what the parents claimed and what the children described. None of it was dramatic, but the pattern was clear. It wasn't neglect in the criminal sense. It was neglect in the practical one. The kind of neglect that doesn't leave bruises, but builds a quiet hollowness in a child's life. A few days later, I received a call from Daniel's teacher. She didn't say much, only that she missed seeing me and hoped things were okay. I could hear the rest in her voice, the uncertainty, the concern. I thanked her, told her things were in progress, and promised to keep her updated. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the place where Daniel used to do his homework, the same spot where Ava once spilled juice and cried until I replaced her drawing. Those memories hadn't left me, but I had learned to stop living inside them. Charlotte reached out twice during that period, once by email, once by text. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask about the children. She asked about logistics, documents, decisions, next steps. I answered only what was required. She had stopped being my daughter in those moments and become a party in a legal process. That wasn't my choice. That was the role she had created when she crossed the line between family and function. I didn't hear from Alex at all. Eventually, the court reconvened. Camille and I appeared in person. Charlotte and Alex were remote. The judge reviewed the findings aloud, reading through the guardian's summary. He noted the inconsistencies, the lack of parental presence, and the continued reliance on third-party caretakers without formal acknowledgement. He stated plainly that the court found the current environment lacking in structure and continuity, both critical for child development. Then came the order. Temporary custody would be reassigned to me, not as a grandmother, but as a legally appointed guardian. The court emphasized that this was a transitional arrangement, subject to review. But the tone was final. It wasn't punishment, it was correction. When I left the courthouse that day, the air felt different. Lighter, maybe? Not because anything had been won, but because clarity had finally arrived. The ambiguity that had governed my life for the past year had been stripped away. The unspoken assumptions, the invisible labor, the slow erosion of respect. It had all been named, recorded, and legally addressed. I returned to the house I had rented in Asheville and began preparing for the next phase. I arranged the children's school transfers. I spoke with Ava's doctor and had her medical records forwarded. I made appointments with counselors for both of them, people trained not just to treat trauma, but to listen for the fractures hidden beneath good manners. When Daniel and Ava arrived, they were quiet at first, uncertain. They had been moved again, rerouted without warning. I didn't overwhelm them. I simply showed them the rooms I had set up, the bookshelves stocked with their favorites, the closet space, the folded towels. I made their favorite meals. I let them sleep in late on the first weekend. I let the silence become soft. Over time, they returned to themselves. Daniel began asking questions again, the kind that made me pause and answer carefully. Ava clung to my arm when we read books and sometimes fell asleep in my lap. I didn't try to replace anything or erase anyone. I simply showed up every morning, every meal, every moment. I never mentioned the hearing. I never used words like custody or case. I let them be children again, not paperwork. At night, after they had gone to sleep, I would sit by the window and think about how rules are made, how we write them, how we break them, how we rewrite them when they fail us. In our house now, the rules were simple. We speak with respect. We ask for help. We apologize when we forget the first two. And no one is invisible. Not the children, not the caretaker, not the woman who used to wear the robe and now wore house slippers, holding her authority not in her voice, but in the choices she had made. The transition into guardianship wasn't marked by ceremony. There was no ribbon to cut, no welcome sign. It arrived like most important changes do, quietly, with paperwork and responsibility. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even call anyone to share the news. I simply printed the final court order, placed it in a manila folder, and slid it into the drawer beside my bed. Then I went into the kitchen and started preparing breakfast like I had every other morning. Daniel and Ava adjusted in pieces, not all at once. There were moments of ease, Daniel helping set the table without being asked, Ava curling beside me during story time, both of them remembering to say thank you after a meal. Then there were setbacks, tears at bedtime, tense silences, outbursts that seemed to have no trigger but carried the weight of confusion and change. I didn't correct every emotion. I didn't try to soothe everything into comfort. I let them feel what they needed to feel while quietly reinforcing that they were safe now, that they were seen, that I wasn't going anywhere, not because I had to stay, but because I chose to. My days were structured but gentle. I woke up before them, made breakfast, packed lunches, drove them to school. I returned home to a quiet house where I worked through legal files I'd been reviewing on the side, consulting work for a friend in the nonprofit sector. My mind still needed precision, order, purpose, but I allowed myself softness too. Walks in the park, a new gardening patch by the porch, evening tea without looking at a clock. People in town began to recognize me as the children's guardian, not their grandmother, not the retired judge, Just the woman who showed up at every parent meeting, who kept emergency contacts updated, who volunteered once a week at the school library. Some asked questions, most didn't. I preferred it that way. I had spent so much of my life being defined by titles. Your Honor, Judge Hanlon, Madam Chair. Then, for a time, I had been reduced to none at all. Now, I stood somewhere in between, not erased, not exalted, simply present. Daniel began calling me Gran again, not with distance or sarcasm, but with a quiet kind of belonging. He would leave notes on the kitchen counter before school. Gran, I have soccer today. Can we eat late? Or, Gran, don't forget Ava's field trip form. Ava drew pictures of us holding hands, her block letters spelling "My Gran is strong" across the top in crayon. These were not awards. They were acknowledgments, and they meant more than any plaque I had ever received. One Saturday afternoon, the three of us visited a museum downtown. It was a small place, local art, rotating exhibits, a children's room with building blocks and puzzles. I watched them interact with the displays, laughing, asking questions, completely absorbed in their world. A woman sitting beside me leaned over and said, "They're lucky to have you." I nodded but didn't answer, because luck had nothing to do with it. They weren't just mine to protect. They were mine to raise now, to teach, to guide. I wasn't just stepping in, I had stepped forward. At night, I sometimes sat at the desk and opened the folder that held the original court documents, the very ones that first transferred guardianship into my hands. I would reread the lines, not to question them, but to remind myself that this role hadn't been given casually. It had been earned, it had been necessary, and it had been right. The role I now held wasn't just legal, it was emotional. It was structural. It was about presence, not as an assistant or a placeholder, but as the axis around which their days now turned. In this house, I didn't enforce the law like I once had. I embodied it, but not the kind written in code books or statute scrolls, the kind written in actions, in promises kept, in morning routines and bedtime rituals, the kind that said, "You matter, you're safe, I'm here." That was the new verdict, not from a bench, but from the kitchen table, the school pickup line. The bedtime light clicked off with a whisper of reassurance. This was my new role, and I stepped into it not as a fallback, not as a favor, but as the one constant in a world that had taught these children too early how easily adults could vanish. I was here now, not just in title, but in truth.